Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Mr. President, what is the parliamentary situation?
Senate is currently in a quorum call.
I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And following that, what is the current situation?
The Senate is post-cloture on the motion to proceed to S-2237.
I thank the distinguished presiding officer, the Senator from New Mexico, for his comments. And, Mr. President, let me just begin by noting that this morning in watching the Today Show, I saw a piece about the Vermont National Guard. We call them the Green Mountain Boys from the time of Ethan Allen. And it was fascinating to watch. Savannah Guthrie, who's one of the anchors of the morning program on the Today Show, her brother is a colonel with the Vermont National Guard, flies her F-16s. And she got to ride on the plane with her brother, which I thought was remarkable. I had the opportunity to do that before with them. It is for those of us who usually combine to our flying and airlines, this is a little bit different, both in takeoff, visibility, maneuvers. I've never been on a commercial airplane where I've pulled anywhere from 5 to 9 Gs, as this plane was, but I was glad to see Colonel Guthrie recognized, but also all the men and women of the Vermont National Guard. This was a group that, in the hours after 9/11, the tragedy of 9/11, they immediately took to the air and guarded the skies over New York City. I recall when our Adjutant General Mike Doobie called me to tell me that the Green Mountain Boys were giving protection around the clock over New York City. I asked him, where are you basing them from? He said, Vermont. I said, well, how long does it take you to get to New York City? He told me with the afterburners, a matter of minutes. I've never been quite able to make that flight in a commuter plane from Burlington, Vermont to New York City. But they would stay there, be refueled midair. Everybody, whether on vacation or not, showed up at the Vermont Guard. Our mechanics, flight administrators, pilots, of course, and kept those planes going around the clock for weeks. Did not miss a single day of their mission or a single minute of their mission, even with all the calibration of weapons and radar and everything else. It was a remarkable scene, and I'm glad to see them recognized this morning. And as a Vermonter, I'm extraordinarily proud of our Vermont National Guard, both our Army Guard and our Air Guard. They do all the people of our state proud. Mr. President, another matter, and I'd ask, as in morning business.
Without objection.
Small businesses and working families throughout Vermont and around the country are facing incredibly challenging times. These problems are especially acute in my state, where we rely so heavily on small businesses to create jobs for our citizens and to make Vermont the desirable place to live and to visit that it is. The federal government has rightly recognized the important role that small businesses play in our economy. From SBA loans to USDA rural development grants to small business set-asides or government contracts, a variety of targeted federal programs join with small businesses to help them grow and prosper. And this Congress has enacted several job-creating steps. Just last year, I was able to lead the effort here in the Senate to enact a major overhaul of our nation's outdated patent laws. The Leahy-Smith America Invents Act is going to create jobs, but also, and very importantly, it's going to help unleash more American innovation and doesn't add a penny to our deficit. In fact, last year, Vermont was awarded more patents per capita than any state in the Union. Of course, those patents mean more jobs for Vermonters. And 2 weeks ago, we made further progress by passing a transportation funding bill. It's going to make vital investments in our nation's roads and bridges and transit systems, and a student loan bill that will lower the cost of college borrowing for thousands of students and their families. You might say these student loans are extremely important. I remember the one I had when I was in law school, 10-year loan. 2 things happened the year of that last payment, that 10th payment on my student loan from law school. One, a satisfaction my wife Marcella and I had in paying off the loan, but the second was that same year I was sworn into the United States Senate. I wonder if I would have been here had we not been able to have the money to go through school. But I think we can and must do more to help our struggling small businesses and working families. That's why I strongly support the bill before us today that will provide small businesses with tax incentives to begin hiring again. The bill is a multi-pronged strategy for spurring job creation and create a tax credit for businesses that hire new workers or increase wages for their current workers. In other words, instead of saying we just give a tax break to extraordinarily wealthy people, somehow jobs will create, we say, let's see the jobs. Show me the jobs. Show me the jobs. If you have a tax credit for businesses that hire new workers or increase wages for their current workers, then that is a good use of our tax code. And secondly, it would allow businesses to immediately write off all the major purchases they make this year. That's a tangible incentive for new investments and new hires right away. I don't support this bill just because the President supports it or the Democratic leader supports it or most of the members of my side of the aisle support it. They all do stand behind this effort. I'm grateful for that. I support this bill because I've heard from small business owners in Vermont, Democratic and Republican alike, who tell me they would make capital improvements and put people to work immediately if this bill were signed into law. And I suspect the same would be true in virtually every other state in this country. On the shores of Lake Champlain, in the northern border town of Highgate, Vermont, sits one of America's most genuine and beautiful family resorts, the Tyler Place Family Resort. Year after year, families flock to the resort to spend time with their families, swimming and boating and enjoying a summer campfire. It is the kind of place that draws the same families year after year, where multi-generational families take time to enjoy each other's company, as well as the great food and the magnificent views. It's easy to forget, especially when you're sitting there watching the sunset over beautiful, great big Lake Champlain. There's one of the millions of small businesses that keep America's economy moving forward and Americans at work. Last year I heard from the owners of the resort, including Pixley Tyler Hill, a dogged advocate for Vermont's tourism industry and for Lake Champlain, about their interest in seeing an extension of the bonus depreciation provision that expired in December. Her brother, Ted Tyler, summed it up by saying, "These changes in the tax law make all the difference in the world in decisions whether to spend money and thereby stimulate the economy and increase employment in the process. For example, consider a resort deciding whether to add tennis courts, put in a new sewer system, upgrade roads, or do major landscaping work. Say at an anticipated cost of $300,000. Absent bonus depreciation, the company will have paid $300,000, but it can only deduct $20,000 that year as an expense for tax purposes. True enough that over the next 14 years, the business can continue to write off $20,000. But how many small businesses can afford to wait that long to recoup the $280,000 they no longer have? Pixley and Ted had me sold the minute they explained that this tax incentive was a difference between making new investments and hiring someone and sitting on their hands waiting for things to change. Extending the provision alone is a reason enough to pass the bill. Mr. President, this bill is full of a million other reasons why we should be working with all the determination we can muster and promptly pass it. Pass it now, while the economy needs it. It's a good, solid reason for each of the jobs we create for working families and businesses all over America. So I urge all senators to work without delay on this important legislation. Businesses in each of our 50 states are waiting for us to lend another helping hand to the Economic Recovery Act, and I'd ask consent to my full statement. That matter be placed in the record. Is that right?
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, one last matter. It's been nearly 3 months since the Senate passed the bipartisan Leahy-Crapo Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act. 3 months. We're no closer to enacting this bill into law than we were in April, when 68 senators, Republican and Democratic senators alike, voted for this critical legislation to protect women from domestic and sexual abuse. And I'm concerned that politics threaten to get in the way of passing this critical legislation this year. Protecting every victim of this violence should be above politics. Members of Congress in both chambers set aside the political rhetoric, act swiftly to reauthorize this landmark legislation and save countless lives. And time is running out. There are only a few weeks left in this session before election year politics take over and Congress comes to a standstill. There are critical improvements in the Leahy-Crapo reauthorization bill that will not take effect unless Congress acts. We can't simply say that, oh, if we don't enact it, maybe we can do it next year or the year after. There are a lot of major programs that can only be enacted in this bill, not in appropriations, not any other way. The SALT programs then will not receive the added support they need unless we pass our bill into law. Legislation's emphasis on increasing housing protections for victims, preventing homicides, will not have an opportunity to help vulnerable victims across the country. Important improvements in campus safety, prevention program for teens will not occur. Immigrant victims, Native women, LGBT victims will continue to remain without the services, protection they need and deserve. The legislation is too important to wait. I hear from victims and the professionals who work on their behalf. They say they need the improvements made by the Leahy-Crapo bill. They need them today. The legislation is particularly important during difficult economic times because the economic pressures facing many Americans can pose additional hurdles. Active community networks are needed to provide support to victims in these circumstances, like emergency shelters and transitional housing and counseling. Late last month, I had the opportunity to speak at the VAWA National Days of Action rally, where survivors and professionals in the field, those who have dedicated their lives to helping victims all over the country, gathered together to send Congress a message. And they told me that they are very frustrated by the lack of progress in passing VAWA, and rightfully so, because they and the victims they serve are the ones who are affected by Congress inaction. They were so inspired when this body came together and 68 of us voted to pass it. Now they say, when are we going to finish? The message to Congress was loud and clear. Do your job. Pass VAWA now. and supporting the work of these tireless advocates and the victims they help should be our priority. Victims should not be forced to wait any longer. They're not going to be able to benefit from the improvements we made in the Senate bill unless both houses of Congress vote to pass this legislation. Problems facing us are too serious for Congress to delay. Remember, this kind of violence knows no political party. Its victims are Republican and Democrat, rich and poor, young and old. As I said so many times, a victim is a victim is a victim. And helping these victims, all these victims should be our goal. I'd ask consent that my full statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I yield the floor, but first I suggest you have the quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
is recognized.
Mr. President, may I ask unanimous consent that the pending quorum call be lifted?
Without objection.
And may I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business?
Without objection.
Mr. President, we were here 2 winters ago in February when Washington was hit by a snowstorm that achieved the nickname Snowmageddon. The city and, in fact, much of the mid-Atlantic was buried under feet of snow. It was the biggest snowstorm in 90 years for this area. People in Washington were struggling to get to work and to school. People went without power for days. And this being Washington, some of our colleagues here in the Senate seized on that opportunity to mock climate change and to suggest that these winter snowstorms were inconsistent with the projections of what would happen from global warming and climate change. As an initial matter, that's just a false comparison from the very get-go, all by itself. Climate science models have predicted consistently that as polar ice caps and glaciers melt and more water enters the system, we can expect heavier precipitation events. One of the ways that has been described is if you have a pot on the stove and you've got the heat underneath it and it's simmering and you turn up the heat, you get more activity in the pot. You add energy to a dynamic system like a pot of boiling water and it creates more energy in the dynamic environment. In the same way, the extra energy coming in because of climate change, because of our carbon pollution in the atmosphere, is energizing our atmosphere and our weather, and we're getting weather extremes as a result. There is an article in Science Daily headlined, "Arctic Ice Melt is Setting Stage for Severe Winters." And it says, the dramatic melt-off of Arctic sea ice due to climate change is hitting closer to home than millions of Americans might think. That's because melting Arctic sea ice can trigger a domino effect leading to increased odds of severe winter weather outbreaks in the northern hemisphere's middle latitudes. Think, the article continues, the Snowmageddon storm that hamstrung Washington, D.C. during February 2010. I ask unanimous consent that this article be appended at the end of my remarks.
Without objection.
So that shows that the original challenge to climate change theory based on the incident of Snowmageddon was, like so much that is said to challenge climate change, phony, just outright wrong, misunderstanding how it works and misrepresenting what it shows. Scientists have recently published an article in Oceanography that demonstrates, again, that link between climate change and severe winter weather in the northern hemisphere's middle latitudes. So I think that can be pretty swiftly debunked as a phony claim against the facts of climate change that are surrounding us. But look around at what's happening now. We're seeing extreme weather on the other side. Last week, Eugene Robinson wrote in his Washington Post column that was entitled "Feeling the Heat" that if you still don't believe in climate change, quote, you're either deep in denial or delirious from the heat. And he points out that the evidence is really mounting up in irresistible and ultimately irrefutable ways. To quote from his article, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says the past winter was the 4th warmest on record in the United States. To top that, spring, which meteorologists define as the months of March, April, and May, was the warmest since record-keeping began in 1895. This spring, March, April, and May, was the warmest since record-keeping began in 1895. He continues, if you don't believe me or the scientists, ask a farmer whose planting seasons have gone awry. The Bloomberg News recently wrote a story that was entitled, U.S. Corn Growers Farming in Hell as Midwest Heat Spreads. The story reported that corn crops are in the worst condition since 1988 and that 53% of the Midwest is experiencing moderate to extreme drought conditions. And I'd ask unanimous consent that the Bloomberg article that I have referenced also be appended at the conclusion of my remarks.
Without objection.
It's not just the agricultural sector that is getting clobbered by the drought and the heat. As the presiding officer, Senator Udall of New Mexico, knows all too well, and to quote from a New York Times story, explosive wildfires have burned across much of the West in recent weeks. In southwestern New Mexico, your home state, the largest wildfire in state history has burned nearly 300,000 acres. And it describes other fires on the loose in Colorado, in Utah. The High Park fire burning near Fort Collins is one of the largest and most destructive blazes in the state's history. Also, Colorado had more than half a dozen fires burning, and it said conditions have not been this bad in a decade. So we are seeing exactly the kind of extreme weather conditions that the climate scientists, who the deniers have always mocked and made fun of, actually predicted. They predicted that this would happen, and it is, in fact, happening. Now, it's clear that you can't take a particular storm and say, this storm, this fire, this drought was the product of climate change. The example that people use to describe what's going on is it's like loading dice. And the more you load the dice, the more the numbers you've loaded the dice to show up. And so you will get more weather events. Even if you don't load the dice, you're sometimes going to get double sixes. So you can't show that every double six is because the dice were loaded. But when you see more and more double sixes showing up, more than history would suggest, more than the odds would suggest, then something's going on. And that's what we've done. By loading our atmosphere with carbon pollution, we have loaded the dice for these extreme weather events, and now we are reaping that bitter harvest from the pollution that we've thrown up there. And unfortunately, the bitter harvest here in this city is that we continue to listen to propaganda and nonsense from the polluters that is designed specifically to create enough doubt to prevent us from taking action about something that is creating these immense consequences for foresters and firefighters in the West, for corn farmers in the Midwest, and for anybody who has to experience extraordinary weather events like Snowmageddon, so-called, here in Washington. These things are beginning to have an effect as real life begins to model what the climate scientists predicted. NOAA's chief, Jane Lubchenco, spoke before an audience in Australia, which is experiencing very similar conditions, said that the extreme weather events are convincing many Americans that climate change is a reality, and we are seeing that more and more. Yale, George Mason University, and Knowledge Networks did some polling on this subject. 69% of the respondents said they agreed that, quote, global warming is affecting the weather in the United States, versus 30% who said they disagreed. So better than 2 to 1, the American people are ready for us to do something about this. They know that there's a connection, and they expect us to take responsible action. Gallup polls are reflecting a rebound in the public's concern about climate change from 51% in 2011 up to 55% in March of this year. Before the recession, it was all the way up to 66% before the economic issues pushed it aside. The contention that the polluting industries and their mouthpieces here in Washington make, that the jury is still out on climate change caused by carbon pollution, is simply false. The jury is not still out. The verdict is in. The verdict is clear, and we should start doing something about it. When I come to give these talks on the Senate floor, I often quote a letter from back in October 2009 that was signed by virtually every major scientific organization in the country: the Chemical Society, the Geophysical Union, the Meteorological Society, the Agronomy Society, the Botanical Society, the Soil Science Society, the American Statistical Association. I could go on and on. But the point is not to name all the multiple, responsible, respected scientific organizations that signed it, but to read what it was that they said. Here's what they said. And if you think about it as I read it, think about how cautious scientists ordinarily are in the language that they use. Here's what they said. Observations throughout the world make it clear that climate change is occurring, and rigorous scientific research demonstrates, not suggests, demonstrates that the greenhouse gases emitted by human activities are, not maybe, are the primary driver. These conclusions are based on multiple independent lines of evidence. And contrary assertions are inconsistent with an objective assessment of the vast body of peer-reviewed science. That's a very science-y way of saying something that is pretty harsh, and that is that all these contrary assertions about climate change simply cannot be reconciled with an objective assessment of the facts, of the vast body of peer-reviewed research. So if it can't be reconciled with an objective assessment, what kind of assessment is it getting? What it's getting, I submit, Mr. President, is a phony assessment, a political propaganda-driven assessment, an assessment whose purpose is simply to create enough doubt to slow down political action, to preserve the status quo, and to allow the pollution to continue to pour out of these smokestacks. And I speak very specifically about smokestacks because Rhode Island is a downwind state, and so much of the coal pollution that gets piped up into the atmosphere through Midwestern smokestacks ends up landing in my state. It lands in the form of ozone in particular, and there are days in a Rhode Island summer that looks clear, it looks beautiful. You're driving by sparkling Narragansett Bay in the morning on your way to work, and off goes the radio, and the radio jock says, talking, giving the news announcements of the day, today's a bad air day in Rhode Island. And infants should stay indoors, the elderly should stay indoors, people with breathing difficulties should stay indoors. On an otherwise beautiful day, children, seniors, people with breathing difficulties should stay indoors because corporations pumping carbon pollution and other forms of pollution out of their Midwestern smokestacks won't clean up their act. They get to hold Rhode Islanders on a clear summer day captive indoors because they won't clean it up. It's just wrong, Mr. President. It's just plain wrong. And so I'm going to continue to come back to this floor on a regular basis to keep pointing this out. For some reason, this has become the issue in Washington that dare not be mentioned. Well, enough of that. It's time we started to mention it, and it's time we started to force this issue, and it's time we started to do something about it, because any other form of activity faced with these facts would be wildly irresponsible. Let me give the example that I've used before. You're a parent. You have responsibility for the welfare and well-being of your child. Your child is showing symptoms. You don't know quite what is wrong. You take her to the doctor, and the doctor says, something's wrong here, she needs treatment. Treatment's not going to be easy, it's not going to be cheap, but she needs it. You think, okay, that's bad news. I'll tell you what, though, I'm going to be a responsible parent, and I'm going to go get a second opinion. So you go and you get a second opinion. That doctor says the exact same thing. Your daughter's sick, she needs treatment. So you ask a couple more doctors who are friends. You get a third opinion, a fourth opinion. Let's say that you're the most determined parent in the world, and you go out and you get 99 second opinions. You contact 100 doctors about your daughter's condition. And 97 of those doctors say your daughter is sick and she needs to be taken care of. She needs this treatment. At that point, you say, well, there's still doubt. There are these 3 other doctors who aren't so sure about this, so I'm not going to do it. That's not something a responsible parent would do. I suspect in some circumstances that would be so irresponsible that it might put you into the Child and Family Services offices of your government. But that is exactly what we're being asked to do about climate change here, to ignore the 97% of peer-reviewed climate scientists who understand that this is real, this is man-made, and the consequences are going to be ferocious for us because there's a 3% doubt. And it gets even worse because so many of the scientists involved in the 3% are scientists for hire who have economic ties to the polluting industries. Some of them even go back to previous fights, like over whether cigarette smoking is good enough for you, or whether lead paint is safe for children. These are scientists who have made a career of manufacturing doubt on behalf of the cigarette and tobacco industry, on behalf of the lead paint industry, and now on behalf of the big carbon polluters. In a nutshell, they're phonies, and we're being asked to believe them. So I see that the senator from Florida is here. I think my time at this point has probably expired. I appreciate the time to come before this body and share these views again. I'll close by pointing out that if there's one place where we really need to worry about climate change and about the effects of our carbon pollution, it's not just in our atmosphere. It's not just in the climate. It's not just in the weather. It's in the oceans. It's in the oceans, which are undergoing historic changes as a result of the amount of carbon in our atmosphere. We are acidifying our oceans at a rate that is unprecedented. We are out now of a bandwidth that's lasted for 8,000 centuries. 8,000 centuries. Our entire species has developed within a safe bandwidth of atmospheric carbon and of ocean acidity that we have now, for the first time, stepped out of, and a long way out of. And if we do not take this issue on in a responsible way, we are going to bear an even more bitter harvest. I thank the presiding officer. I yield the floor. Immediately ready to speak. I will not suggest the absence of a quorum.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Are we in morning business, Mr. President?
We are post-cloture time.
Okay, great. Mr. President, when Congress began debating health care in 2009, the goal was to lower the cost of care and to give America the care they need from a doctor they choose. Americans were promised that if they liked the insurance they had and the doctor they had, they would be able to keep the plan and to continue to see the doctor that they liked. Americans were promised that the negotiations would be transparent and televised on C-SPAN. Americans were promised that the bill wouldn't add a dime to the deficit and that it would lower the cost of care. Americans were promised that their premiums would go down by $2,500. Americans were promised that this president would not raise taxes on families with incomes below $250,000. Instead, Congress passed a massive governmental takeover of the health care industry. In the last 2 years, we've seen that Americans can't keep the insurance they had, continue to see the doctor they like, and are paying more for health care now than they would have if this administration had not pushed through the massive 2,700-page bill. The law adds billions to the deficit, and at the end of the day, Americans will find that they are left holding a bag full of empty, broken promises. Today, Mr. President, I want to focus on the broken promises on taxes. The President pledged not to raise taxes on individuals making less than $200,000 and families making less than $250,000 per year. Yet the new individual mandate tax, which the Supreme Court affirmed as a tax increase, will raise $54 billion in new taxes, largely on middle-income Americans between 2015 and 2022. In fact, according to the Congressional Budget Office, 77% of those projected to pay the tax in 2016 will be those earning less than $120,000 per year. Americans earning less than $120,000 clearly meet the President's definition as middle income. The Congressional Budget Office projections confirm that at least 3 out of every 4 Americans subjected to the new individual mandate tax will be the same middle-income taxpayers that President Obama promised would not see their taxes raised by 1 dime. In fact, when asked by George Stephanopoulos of ABC News in September of 2009 if the President rejected the notion that the individual mandate was a tax, the President stated, and I quote, "I absolutely reject that notion," end quote. The President wasn't equivocal, and he didn't leave any room for interpretation. So let's be clear. This President and the Democrat leaders here in Congress sold Obamacare as if it did not contain significant new tax increases on the middle class. Yet we now know that what they're really selling was an incredible bait and switch. They were in fact enacting $54 billion in new individual mandate taxes, primarily on the middle class, by calling it something else. I would note that this tax increase is larger than the Buffett rule tax increase that the President has spent much of the year promoting. The Supreme Court ruled that the individual mandate is not constitutional under either the Commerce Clause or the Necessary and Proper Clause of the Constitution. So there are only 2 options. Either the individual mandate is a tax, and it happens to be a tax that falls hardest on the middle class, or it's unconstitutional. It's estimated that the average tax on an American subject to this new tax increase will be about $1,100 per year. And after paying this tax, these Americans still won't have health insurance. We should not forget that the national health insurance tax is not the only tax increase in Obamacare affecting individuals. Starting next year, individuals will be able to save less money tax-free in flexible spending accounts to pay for their own health care expenses. Currently, there's no statutory limit on FSA contributions, though many FSAs set their own limits. Starting next year, Obamacare will cap the amount that Americans can save in a flexible savings account at only $2,500 per year. And Obamacare will limit tax deductions for those with the largest health care needs by reducing the medical expense deduction from expenses above 7.5% of adjusted gross income to expenses above 10% of adjusted gross income. So at the very time that Obamacare is driving up health care costs, it is also making it more difficult for American families to pay for their own health care needs. These tax increases don't even take into account the new 3.8% tax increase on investment income or the almost 1% Medicare surtax that will be imposed on higher-income Americans starting in 2013, making it more expensive for small business owners to hire new workers or otherwise invest in our economy. These taxes on individuals are in addition to the Obamacare taxes on businesses, such as the new medical device tax or the tanning tax. We know that these taxes on businesses will ultimately be passed through to consumers of health care, driving health care prices even higher. In fact, of the $552 billion in new taxes included in the Obamacare, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation and the Congressional Budget Office, the Joint Economic Committee has estimated that roughly $250 billion are tax increases that will hit the middle class, either directly or through the health care products that they consume. In addition to this new national health insurance tax of $1,100 a year and other tax increases in Obamacare, Americans will see that health care costs will continue to rise. Despite the President's promise that his health care plan would reduce insurance premiums, premiums have increased by over $2,200 since Obama took office, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation. And according to the President's own actuary at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in a report from this month on national health expenditure projections, premiums under the new health care law will rise faster than if we had done nothing at all. And I want to quote from that very report. It says, and I quote, in 2014, growth in private health insurance premiums is expected to accelerate to 7.9%, or 4.1 percentage points higher than in the absence of health reform, end quote. Now think about that, Mr. President, what's actually being said here. That the cost of health insurance would have gone up a lot less per year had we done nothing than what we did with this bill, which is to increase those expenditures for health care by about 7.9%. Americans are going to be stuck paying higher costs for health insurance, medical devices due to the tax on these sectors that this bill imposes. Americans know firsthand that we're going to continue to struggle with an economy that's not performing well. We've got an unemployment rate that remains at 8% now for 41 consecutive months. Now on the immediate horizon, the American people stare down an enormous tax increase from a health reform law that they didn't want and still don't want. Americans are also seeing this law has impacted our economy. According to a recent poll, 48% of businesses that are not currently hiring list the potential cost of health care regulations as a reason for not seeking new employees. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, Obamacare will mean 800,000 fewer jobs over the next decade. The last 3 years have made it very clear that Obamacare is making our economy worse by driving up costs and discouraging job creation. Moving forward, Congress needs to start by repealing Obamacare. We need to repeal Obamacare and enact common-sense, step-by-step reforms that protect Americans' access to the care that they need from a doctor they choose at a lower cost. Republicans will not repeat the Democrats' mistakes. We will not rush to pass a massive bill that the American people don't support. We need to do this the right way. No backroom deals or 2,700-page bills that no one has read. This President owes it to Americans to admit his broken promises and to work with Republicans to put in place real health care reforms that will actually help lower health insurance costs for individuals and families and ensure that Americans can get the care they need when they need it. Mr. President, the taxes that I've mentioned in the health care law are going to add up to a massive tax increase on average, ordinary Americans, and all the analysis that's been done by the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Congressional Budget Office, the Joint Economic Committee, comes to that very same conclusion. This is a tax that's going to hit middle-income Americans, notwithstanding the President's promise that he wouldn't raise taxes on those making less than $200,000 a year. 75% of that tax burden in that individual mandate tax, which is $54 billion, as I mentioned, will hit those making less than $120,000 per year. And so the whole idea of promises made, promises broken, I think is the narrative that's attached itself to this health care reform law, Mr. President. And I would submit that the United States Congress and the President need to work together to repeal this law and to work, as I said, in a constructive way to put in place common-sense, step-by-step reforms that actually will drive the cost of health care down for Americans, because that is the one thing that Americans, as they look at the health care economy today, want to see. They want to know that their costs are going to go down rather than up. They continue to see these increases in premiums year over year over year, and it continues to affect our economy. And the mandates that are imposed upon employers in this health care law as well are going to lead to fewer jobs. That is the result, the outcome, if you will, of this health care law, Mr. President. It's higher cost for Americans, as I pointed out, and it's going to mean fewer jobs for American workers. And now, coupled on top of that, we have, as recently as yesterday, the President coming out and saying that he now wants to raise taxes on those small businesses in our country. The tax that he's proposed on those making more than $250,000 a year, interestingly enough, hits 940,000 small business owners. 53% of the pass-through income would face higher taxes as a result of the proposal that he made just yesterday. And the people who run those businesses employ 25% of the American workforce. And so we're talking about huge new burdens on our economy at a time, Mr. President, when we just absolutely cannot afford it. 41 consecutive months of 8% or higher unemployment, 23 million Americans either unemployed or underemployed, 5.4 million Americans who have been unemployed for a long period of time, and the weakest recovery literally since the end of World War II. Those are the economic circumstances we find ourselves in today. And now we have proposals coming out of the White House, in addition to the burdens imposed by Obamacare, that would lead to higher taxes on the very people that we look to get us out of this economic circumstance, and that is our small businesses, our entrepreneurs, all of whom are going to be faced with higher taxes because of the President's proposals. Mr. President, we can do better for the American people. We can get this economy growing again with common sense health care reforms, common sense tax reforms, regulatory reforms that lower the cost and the burden of doing business in this country, an energy policy, a comprehensive energy policy that will make sure that we're developing our own energy sources in this country, and getting federal spending under control. We need a smaller government, federal government, Mr. President, and a bigger, more robust private economy. You cannot do that by continually piling more taxes and more regulations and more mandates and more requirements on the very people that create jobs. The American people deserve better. We can do better, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida is recognized.
Mr. President, as a courtesy to Senator Inhofe, I'd ask consent that Senator Inhofe